Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Before there was light, before there was darkness, before there was anything at all, there was nothing. Not the kind of nothing where you close your eyes and see black. Not the empty feeling of a vacant room or a silent night. This was absolute nothingness. No up, no down, no here, no there. No time ticking forward, no space stretching outward. Just void. Pure, endless, impossible void. The ancient Greeks called it chaos. And from this chaos, from this primordial emptiness that somehow contained everything and nothing simultaneously, the entire universe would unfold. Every god you've ever heard of, every hero whose name still echoes through history, every monster that haunted ancient nightmares, they all trace back to this moment, to this impossibility, to the first breath of existence. Tonight, you're going to hear the whole story. Not the sanitized versions from movies or the brief mentions from high school mythology class. The complete tale, from the very first spark of creation to the last hero sailing home across wine-dark seas. You'll hear about gods who devoured their children, heroes who descended into the land of the dead, monsters born from divine blood, and prophecies that always came true, no matter how desperately anyone tried to avoid them. So settle in, get comfortable, let the weight of the day slip away, because you're about to journey back to a time when gods walked the earth, when the line between mortal and divine was crossed regularly and often regretted, when every mountain held a mystery and every shadow might conceal something that could change your fate forever. And if you find yourself drifting off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. These stories have been putting people to sleep in the best possible way for thousands of years. But before we begin, if you're enjoying this journey through ancient myth, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It helps more people find these stories. Now, let the modern world fade. Let's go back to the beginning. Back to before the beginning. Back to chaos. Chaos wasn't a god, not really. It was more like a state of being, or perhaps a state of unbeing. The Greeks imagined it as a vast yawning gap, a cosmic chasm of infinite depth and infinite potential. Everything that would ever exist was somehow present in chaos, but none of it was formed. None of it was real. None of it was separate from anything else. It was the ultimate possibility, the blank canvas before the first brushstroke, the silence before the first note of music. But possibility, it turns out, doesn't stay still for long. From chaos emerged the first actual beings, the primordial deities who weren't created by anyone, but simply came into existence because existence itself demanded them. First came Gaia, and when she emerged, she brought with her the concept of solidity, of presence, of being something rather than nothing. Gaia was the earth itself, not a goddess who lived in the earth or ruled over it, but the actual physical ground, the foundation, the base upon which everything else would rest. She was vast beyond imagining, her body stretching in all directions, her consciousness extending into every particle of soil, every grain of sand, every stone and mountain that would ever form. She was alone, though, the first conscious being in all of existence, surrounded by the fading remnants of chaos. And perhaps loneliness is one of those fundamental forces, because what happened next suggests that even the primordial forces of the universe crave companionship. From the depths beneath even Gaia, Tartarus emerged. Dark, gloomy Tartarus, a place so far below the surface world that later myths would say a bronze anvil dropped from Earth would fall for 9 days before reaching its depths. Tartarus would become the prison, the abyss, the place of punishment and exile. But in these early moments, Tartarus was simply there, a counterpoint to Gaia's surface, the below to her above. Then came Eros, and this wasn't the chubby baby with arrows from Valentine's Day cards. This was primordial Eros, the fundamental force of attraction and desire that would drive everything that came after. Without Eros, nothing would be drawn together. No unions would form, no children would be born, no connections would be made. Eros was the cosmic glue, the magnetic pull between beings, the inexplicable force that makes things want to combine, to create, to perpetuate. The darkness gave birth to more darkness. Erebus emerged, the personification of deep shadow and gloom, the darkness that exists in the depths of the earth and in the corners the light never reaches. And with Erebus came Nyx, night herself, draped in shadowy veils, mysterious and powerful. These two, darkness and night, came together as Eros compelled them, and from their union came ether, the bright upper air that gods would breathe, and Hemera, the day, the light that chases away her mother's darkness each morning, only to be chased in turn each evening. So now we have the basic structure of reality: earth, underworld, desire, darkness, night, light, day. The raw materials of existence, if you will. But Gaia, vast and fertile and powerful, wasn't finished. She looked upon herself, this endless expanse of ground with nothing above it, and from her own substance, through her own power, she brought forth Uranus, the sky. Some versions of the story say she created him to be her equal, to cover her completely. Others suggest he simply emerged from her as she had emerged from chaos. Either way, Uranus came into being, and he was vast. His starry form stretched across all of Gaia, covering every part of her, embracing the earth from horizon to horizon. And here's where things get complicated, as they always do with Greek mythology. Gaia and Uranus weren't just two primordial deities existing near each other. They became lovers, husband and wife, in a union that was both cosmic and deeply physical. Uranus would descend each evening, covering Gaia completely. And from their repeated unions came the first generation of what we might actually call children. Not forces of nature or abstract concepts, but individual beings with personalities, ambitions, and the capacity for complex thought. First came the Titans, 12 of them, 6 male and 6 female. Each was enormous, powerful beyond imagining, immortal, and destined to shape the cosmos in profound ways. The males were Oceanus, who would become the vast river encircling the world; Coeus, whose name means inquiry and questioning; Creus, the pillar of the south; Hyperion, who would light the heavens; Iapetus, who would father some of the most important figures in all mythology; and Cronus, the youngest, the cleverest, and ultimately the most dangerous. The females were Theia, who would shine bright; Rhea, who would flow like gentle stream; Themis, who embodied divine law and order; Mnemosyne, memory itself; Phoebe, the bright and pure; and Tethys, the nourishing flow of fresh water. These titans were the first gods, the proto-deities who would establish the patterns that later generations would follow. They were enormous, towering, capable of reshaping the world with their thoughts and actions. They represented fundamental aspects of existence, but were also individuals with desires, fears, and the capacity for both great creation and terrible destruction. But Gaia and Uranus's children weren't finished. After the Titans came 3 more sons, and these were different. These were the Cyclopes, and each of them had a single eye in the center of their forehead. Not a missing eye or a deformity, but one large, perfectly round eye that saw deeper and clearer than any 2 eyes ever could. Their names were Brontes, which means thunder, Steropes, lightning, and Arges, brightness. Even from birth, these 3 had a gift for craftsmanship, an understanding of how to shape metal and fire into objects of unimaginable power. They were master craftsmen, future forgers of weapons that would shake the heavens. And finally, Gaia brought forth 3 more sons, and these were the most unusual of all. The Hecatonchires, which means the 100-handed ones. Each had 50 heads arranged around their shoulders, all speaking simultaneously in a constant rumble of voices, and 100 arms extending from their massive bodies. Their names were Cottus, Briareus and Gyges, and their strength was proportional to their size. 100 hands that could hurl mountains, 50 mouths that could cry out in fury, beings of raw power that served no purpose yet, but would one day tip the balance of cosmic war. Now here's where we encounter the first conflict in the history of the universe, and it's depressingly familiar. Uranus looked at his children, and he was pleased with the Titans. They were beautiful, powerful, magnificent. But the Cyclopes, with their single eyes, the Hecatonchires, with their grotesque multiple heads, and arms? These he found disturbing, monstrous, offensive to look upon. And so, with the casual cruelty that would characterize divine behavior for millennia to come, he made a decision. These children would not see the light of day. They would not live upon their mother's surface. They would be hidden away, buried deep, imprisoned in the darkest depths of Tartarus, that gloomy abyss far below even Gaia's deepest roots. And not only would he imprison them, he would stuff them back inside Gaia herself, pushing them down through her layers, forcing them into her womb, into her depths, causing her tremendous pain. Imagine being a mother who has just given birth, and your husband decides he doesn't like how some of the children look, so he shoves them back inside you and locks them away in your deepest places. Gaia felt every moment of their imprisonment. She felt their weight, their confusion, their suffering, her own children, trapped within her, unable to emerge, unable to live. Her rage grew, and in that rage, Gaia formed a plan. She took a piece of herself, the hardest substance she possessed, and from it, she crafted something new, something that had never existed before. A sickle, a great curved blade of adamantine, the hardest metal in existence, so hard it could cut through anything, even divine flesh. She hid this weapon in a sacred cave on Mount Othrys, and then she called her children to her, the Titans who walked free upon her surface. She told them what their father had done. She told them about their brothers locked away in darkness. She told them of her pain. And then she asked them a question that would echo through mythology forever after. Which of them would be brave enough, bold enough, to take up the sickle and punish their father? Which of them would avenge their imprisoned brothers? The older Titans recoiled. Their father was Uranus, the sky itself, vast and powerful, and seemingly untouchable. To attack him would be to attack the fundamental order of reality. They were afraid, and perhaps rightly so. But Cronus, the youngest, did not recoil. Cronus, whose name might mean crow or time or both, looked at his mother, and he agreed. He would do it. He would take the sickle. He would hide in the cave and wait for his father to descend in his nightly embrace of Gaia. And when that moment came, he would strike. So that's what happened. As evening fell and Uranus descended from the heights to cover Gaia in their cosmic union, Cronus waited in his hiding place, sickle gripped tight. Uranus was completely unaware, lost in the moment, vulnerable in a way he would never be again. And Cronus emerged from the cave, and with one swift, brutal motion, he used the adamantine sickle to castrate his father. The blade cut clean through divine flesh, and Uranus's severed genitals fell toward the earth. What happened next is one of those moments in mythology that's both grotesque and strangely beautiful. As drops of Uranus's blood fell upon Gaia, they didn't simply soak into the soil. Each drop spawned something new. Where the blood touched ground, the Furies burst forth. 3 ancient goddesses of vengeance with snakes for hair and eyes that wept blood. Their purpose would be to punish crimes, especially crimes against family, and they would be relentless, unstoppable, merciless. The giants also emerged from that divine blood, massive and powerful, destined to challenge the gods in ages to come. And the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, sprang up where other drops fell, gentler spirits who would inhabit the ash trees and watch over them. But the most famous birth from this violent act was still to come. Uranus's severed genitals didn't fall to earth. They fell into the sea, and as they sank through the water, White foam gathered around them, divine essence mixing with salt water, creating something entirely new. From that foam, Aphrodite emerged, the goddess of love and beauty, born from violence and castration, but embodying desire and attraction. She rose from the waves near the island of Cyprus, already fully formed, already impossibly beautiful, already powerful enough to drive both gods and mortals to distraction. Her birth was in some ways the opposite of what created it. Where Cronus acted with violence, Aphrodite would inspire passion. Where blood had fallen, beauty rose. It's one of those contradictions the Greeks seem to understand better than we do, that creation and destruction are often two sides of the same coin. Uranus, mutilated and humiliated, withdrew from the world. Some stories say he simply pulled back to the far reaches of the sky, never to descend again. Others say he died from the wound, though how a primordial deity dies is never quite explained. But before he departed, he made a prophecy, as wounded fathers in Greek mythology so often do. He looked at Cronus, his youngest son who had betrayed him so brutally, and he promised that the same fate awaited him. One day, Cronus's own children would rise against him. One day, he too would be overthrown. The cycle would continue. Cronus paid no attention to the prophecy. He had power now, real power. He freed some of his siblings from imprisonment, but notably, not all of them. The Cyclops and Hecatonchires remained locked in Tartarus. Maybe he was afraid of them, or maybe he just preferred having potential rivals locked away. Either way, he established himself as the ruler of the cosmos. He married his sister Rhea, which would have been weird if there were anyone else to marry. But when you're one of 12 people and you're all siblings, your options are limited. The other Titans paired off as well. Oceanus with Tethys, producing the rivers and sea nymphs. Hyperion with Thea, bringing forth Helios the sun, Selene the moon, and Eos, the rosy-fingered dawn. Coeus with Phoebe, giving birth to Leto, who would mother important gods. Iapetus with the Oceanid Clymene, fathering Atlas, who would hold the sky. Prometheus, who would champion humanity. Epimetheus, who would make crucial mistakes. And Menœtius, who would be struck down for his pride. Under Cronus's rule, the world entered what later ages would call the Golden Age. It was a time of peace, of prosperity, of abundance. Humans lived during this time, and according to legend, they were innocent, happy, without suffering or toil. Food grew without cultivation. The earth provided everything needed. There was no war, no strife, no death as we know it. People simply lived in contentment until one day they peacefully passed on, becoming gentle spirits that watched over the world. But beneath this golden surface, something was happening in Cronus's mind. That prophecy his father had made, the curse that he would be overthrown by his own children, it gnawed at him constantly. Every time he looked at Rhea, every time he thought about the future, that prophecy whispered in his ear. It became an obsession, a fear that grew larger each day until it consumed his every thought. Power, once gained, becomes the thing you fear losing most. And Cronus feared losing power more than anything. Rhea became pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy progressed normally, or as normally as divine pregnancies progress. And when the time came, Rhea gave birth to a daughter. They named her Hestia, and she was perfect. A baby goddess with eyes that already showed wisdom, tiny hands that reached for her mother. Rhea held her newborn, and for a moment, everything was joy. Everything was right. Then Cronus took Hestia from Rhea's arms, and before Rhea could even process what was happening, before she could protest or fight or scream, Cronus opened his mouth impossibly wide and swallowed his daughter whole. Not chewing, not killing, just swallowing, sending her down into his stomach where she would remain, trapped but alive, growing to maturity in the darkness of her father's belly. Rhea's screams echoed across creation, but there was nothing she could do. Cronus was too powerful, too quick, too determined. He explained calmly, coldly, that this was necessary. The prophecy demanded it. He would not be overthrown. Therefore, his children could not be allowed to grow strong enough to challenge him. This was the only way. Years passed, and Rhea became pregnant again. She gave birth to another daughter, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and again Cronus took the baby and swallowed her. Rhea pleaded, begged, fought, but it made no difference. Demeter joined Hestia in the darkness. Another pregnancy, another daughter. Hera, who would have been queen of the gods, who would have been powerful and majestic, swallowed. Then came the first son, Hades, dark-haired, serious even as an infant, destined to rule the dead, swallowed. Another son, Poseidon, born with eyes the color of the deep sea, swallowed. 5 children, 5 times Rhea experienced the joy of birth, followed immediately by the horror of watching Cronus consume their baby. 5 times she was powerless to stop it. The trauma of it was beyond imagining. She was a mother who had never been allowed to be a mother, whose children existed but were lost to her, trapped inside their father, growing up in darkness, completely cut off from the world they should have inherited. And here's a strange thing about Greek mythology that sometimes gets glossed over. The children didn't die in Cronus's stomach. They were immortal, so death wasn't possible. Instead, they grew. They matured. They became adult gods while imprisoned in their father's belly, developing their powers, their personalities, their consciousness. Imagine growing from infancy to adulthood in darkness, your only companions, your siblings, your only knowledge that your father imprisoned you out of fear, the rage that must have built in them, the desire for revenge, the absolute certainty that one day, somehow, they would escape and make him pay. But for now, they remained imprisoned, and Rhea remained in agony. Then she became pregnant for the 6th time. As the pregnancy progressed, she knew she couldn't let this happen again. She couldn't watch another child disappear down Cronus's throat. She went to her mother, Gaia, the original mother, the one who understood more than anyone what it meant to have children taken from you. Together, they formed a plan. When the time came for the birth, Rhea fled. She traveled to the island of Crete, to the slopes of Mount Ida, to a hidden cave called Dictyon. There, in secret, in darkness, with only Gaia and the spirits of the wild to help her, Rhea gave birth to her 6th child, a son. She named him Zeus. For a few precious moments, Rhea held her son. She looked into his eyes and saw intelligence, power, destiny. This child would be different. This child would survive. This child would fulfill the prophecy that haunted Cronus's every waking moment. But first, he had to live. Rhea wrapped a large stone in baby's clothing. She swaddled it carefully, making it look and feel like an infant. Then, with Zeus hidden away in the cave, she returned to Cronus with the stone. She presented it to him, her face showing the appropriate fear and despair. And Cronus, so convinced that he had thought of everything, so certain that he had protected himself from the prophecy, took the bundle and swallowed it without even looking. The stone went down, settling heavy in his stomach among his 5 divine children, and Cronus believed himself safe once more. Meanwhile, in the cave on Crete, Zeus was being raised by the creatures of the wild. The most common version of the story says he was nursed by the goat Amalthea, whose milk had almost magical properties, making him grow strong and swift. Other versions say Amalthea was a nymph who fed him goat's milk and honey. Either way, Zeus thrived. But there was a problem. Babies cry. Babies make noise. And if Cronus heard a baby crying from Crete, he would investigate, and everything would be lost. So the curates, spirits, of the wild and warriors surrounded the cave. Whenever baby Zeus cried, they would dance wildly and clash their spears against their shields, creating such a racket that his cries were completely drowned out. They danced and clashed for years, protecting the secret, allowing Zeus to grow. And grow he did. Unlike his siblings trapped in darkness, Zeus grew up seeing the sky, feeling the sun, learning about the world he would one day rule. He was educated by the wisest teachers. He learned to fight, to think, to plan. The mountain nymphs adored him. The birds and beasts of Crete were his friends. He played in glades and learned from ancient spirits. And eventually, he learned the truth. His mother visited when she could, and she told him everything. About his siblings, about the prophecy, about what he would need to do. By the time Zeus reached adulthood, he was magnificent, tall, powerful, with dark hair and eyes that sparked with intelligence and authority. He also had something his siblings lacked, because they'd been imprisoned since birth. He had experience with the world. He understood how things worked. And he had a plan. First, he needed allies. He left Crete and began to travel, learning about the cosmos under Cronus's rule, making connections, gathering information. He met an Oceanid, a daughter of the Titan Oceanus, named Metis. Her name meant wisdom and cunning, and she possessed both in abundance. When Zeus told her his plan, she agreed to help. Metis concocted a potion, a powerful emetic that would make even a Titan's stomach rebel. The trick was getting Cronus to drink it. Through various means, probably involving disguise and deception, which Zeus was getting quite good at, the potion was administered. Some versions say Metis herself gave it to Cronus disguised as a cupbearer. Others say Zeus served it to him pretending to be a fellow Titan. However it happened, Cronus drank, and his stomach immediately began to churn. He felt sick in a way he'd never experienced before, a rebellion of his own body that he couldn't control. His throat constricted, his gut heaved, and suddenly he was vomiting up everything in his stomach. First came the stone, that rock wrapped in cloth that he'd swallowed thinking it was Zeus. It shot out and landed with a thud. Later, Zeus would set up that stone at Delphi as a monument, a reminder of his father's gullibility. But then came the gods. In reverse order from how they'd been swallowed, they emerged. Poseidon came first, full-grown, powerful, angry. Then Hades, dark and terrible. Hera, majestic and furious. Demeter, whose first sight of the actual harvest would move her to tears. And finally Hestia, the firstborn, the first to go into the darkness, now the last to see the light. 5 gods stood before Cronus, their father, their jailer. They had known nothing but imprisonment. They had spent their entire existence trapped in darkness, growing to maturity while locked away, developing their powers with nothing to use them on. And now they were free. Now they stood in the light, and they wanted revenge. Zeus stepped forward, revealing himself for the first time. Cronus finally understood. The prophecy. The 6th child. The one that got away. His worst fear was standing right in front of him, and worse, was flanked by 5 equally powerful gods who owed him nothing but hatred. But Zeus wasn't done gathering allies. He knew that 6 gods, even powerful ones, might not be enough to overthrow the Titans. So he descended into Tartarus, into those gloomy depths where Cronus had kept the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires imprisoned. He fought Campe, the she-dragon who guarded them, and killed her. Then he freed Uranus's other children, the ones who had been locked away since the beginning. The Cyclopes were grateful in a way that gods rarely are. They had been imprisoned twice, first by Uranus, then by Cronus, locked away simply for being different, for being monstrous. Zeus freed them with no conditions, no demands. So they used their incredible craftsmanship to forge weapons for the young gods. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure lightning that could shatter mountains and shake the heavens. For Poseidon, they forged the trident, a 3-pronged spear that could command the seas and cause earthquakes. For Hades, they crafted the helm of darkness, a helmet that made its wearer completely invisible, impossible to see, or detect. The Hecatonchires, those 100-handed giants, also pledged their loyalty. Their strength was immense, and having 100 hands meant they could hurl projectiles at a rate no normal being could match. They would be the artillery of the coming war, the ranged attackers who could overwhelm through sheer volume. Not all the Titans sided with Cronus. Some saw which way the wind was blowing. Others simply liked Zeus better or believed in the prophecy. Themis, the Titaness of justice, joined Zeus because she understood that the cycle had to continue, that Cronus's paranoid rule was not sustainable. Her son Prometheus, the clever Titan who could see the future, also joined Zeus's side, bringing with him insights that would prove invaluable. Oceanus remained neutral, refusing to fight either side, ancient and wise enough to see that neutrality was sometimes the only winning move. The lines were drawn. On one side, Zeus and his 5 siblings, the Olympians, named for the mountain they claimed as their base. With them stood the Cyclopes, the Hecatonchires, and a few renegade Titans. On the other side stood Cronus and the majority of the Titans, arrayed on Mount Othrys where Cronus had first taken the sickle from the cave. At the head of the Titan forces stood Atlas, son of Iapetus, serving as general and champion. They called it the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. It would last 10 years. 10 years of cosmic combat, of a war so massive that it threatened to tear apart the very fabric of reality. The battles shook the earth. Mountains were torn from their roots and hurled as weapons. The seas boiled when Poseidon's rage turned them to steam. Lightning struck so frequently that the sky seemed to be perpetually ablaze. The Hecatonchires stood at the battlements and hurled boulders by the hundreds, massive rocks the size of hills flying through the air like hailstones. Zeus stood at the front, his thunderbolt crackling with power. Each time he threw it, it would streak across the sky, the sound of thunder announcing its passage, then strike with devastating force before returning to his hand. Poseidon wielded his trident, causing earthquakes that split the battlefield, raising tidal waves to crash against Titan lines. Hades, invisible in his helmet, would appear behind enemy formations, causing chaos and confusion. Hera proved to be a tactician, organizing the divine forces with strategic precision. Demeter used the earth itself as a weapon, causing stone and soil to rise up and entrap Titan warriors. Hestia, though less warlike than her siblings, maintained the divine hearth that gave the Olympians a place to rest and recover, a home base that provided both literal and metaphorical warmth. The Titans fought back with the power of ages. Hyperion threw light so bright it blinded. Creus held his position in the south like an unbreakable pillar. Coeus attacked with questions that confused the mind. They were ancient, experienced, powerful beyond measure, but they lacked the desperate hunger of the younger gods. They lacked the rage of the imprisoned finally freed. For 9 years the war raged on with no clear victor. Both sides were immortal, so death wasn't really the issue. It was exhaustion, demoralization, the slow grinding down of will. The world itself suffered. Mortal humans, those innocent beings who had enjoyed the golden age, found their world torn apart. The perfect peace was shattered. The easy abundance disappeared. The war of the gods brought suffering to the mortal realm, and that suffering would never truly end. In the 10th year, something changed. Zeus rallied his forces for one final desperate assault. The Cyclopes forged new thunderbolts, dozens of them, giving Zeus more ammunition than ever before. The Hecatonchires positioned themselves at optimal points, ready to unleash a barrage that would darken the sky with stone. Poseidon called forth every sea and river to fight. Hades spread fear and dread through the Titan ranks, invisible death stalking among them. The final battle was apocalyptic. The Hecatonchires threw 300 boulders simultaneously, 100 from each of them, a storm of stone that crashed into the Titan forces like a meteor shower. Zeus threw thunderbolt after thunderbolt, the sound of continuous thunder echoing across all of creation. The earth cracked, the sky bled fire, The seas rose up in columns miles high. Cronus, seeing his forces faltering, seeing the prophecy unfulfilling itself despite everything he'd done to prevent it, fought with the desperation of someone who knows they've already lost. But desperation is not the same as strength. His own children, led by the son he tried to prevent from existing, overwhelmed him. Atlas was captured. The other Titans fell one by one, not dead but defeated, their will to fight finally broken. The war was over. The Olympians had won. The prophecy was fulfilled. Cronus, who had castrated his own father to gain power, was now overthrown by his own son. The cycle had completed itself, and a new cosmic order would replace the old. But what to do with the defeated Titans? Zeus showed a mercy his father had never possessed, but it was a harsh mercy. The Titans who had fought against him were cast down into Tartarus, that gloomy abyss at the bottom of the world. The Hecatonchires, finally given a purpose beyond imprisonment, became their jailers, standing guard at the bronze gates, ensuring the Titans would never escape and threaten the new order. Atlas, as the general who had led the Titan forces, received a special punishment. Zeus condemned him to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky for all eternity. Not the earth, as many think, but the sky itself, or perhaps the pillars that separated earth from sky. Either way, Atlas would stand forever, arms raised, bearing a weight that could never be put down, looking out at a world he could no longer touch, a living monument to the cost of backing the wrong side. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, met to divide the cosmos among themselves. They drew lots, which is either the fairest or most arbitrary way to decide such things. Zeus drew the sky and the upper world, becoming king of gods and ruler of the heavens. Poseidon drew the seas, becoming lord of all waters, all oceans, all rivers, all marine life. Hades drew the underworld, becoming the god of the dead, the keeper of souls, the king of a kingdom no one wanted to visit. The earth itself remained common territory, belonging to no one god exclusively, still the domain of their grandmother Gaia. The sisters claimed their own areas of influence. Hestia took the hearth as her sacred space, the center of the home, choosing peace and domesticity over the drama of godly politics. Demeter took the harvest, the growing grain, the cycle of planting and reaping. Hera, most powerful of the sisters, would eventually marry Zeus and become queen of the gods, though that marriage would be anything but peaceful. Zeus established his palace on Mount Olympus, the tallest mountain in Greece. Its peak so high it pierced the clouds and existed halfway between earth and sky. He invited the gods to live there, creating the society of deities that would come to be known as the Olympians. These gods, along with a few others who earned the honor, would form the Greek pantheon, the family of deities who ruled every aspect of existence. But before we talk more about the Olympians themselves, there's something else that happened, something that would define the relationship between gods and mortals forever. Because during this time, Prometheus, that clever Titan who had sided with Zeus, was taking an interest in humanity. The humans who survived the Titanomachy were struggling. The golden age was over. Life was harder now. They were cold, frightened, primitive. And Prometheus, whose name means forethought, looked at them and felt something the other gods rarely felt. Compassion. The gods were dining on Mount Olympus, and Prometheus was invited as an honor for his help in the war. A great sacrifice was being prepared, an ox slaughtered to be divided between gods and humans. Prometheus was given the honor of dividing it. And here's where his trickster nature came out. He created two piles. In one pile, he put all the best meat, the nutritious organs, the fat, but he wrapped it all in the ox's stomach, making it look unappealing. In the other pile, he put only the bones, but he covered them with glistening white fat, making them look delicious. Then he asked Zeus to choose which pile the gods would receive. Zeus, king of the gods, all-seeing and supposedly all-knowing, looked at the two piles. He saw the beautiful white fat, the appealing presentation, and he chose that one. Only after the choice was made did he realize the deception. Beneath the fat was nothing but bones. The humans got all the good meat. Zeus was furious. He felt mocked, tricked, disrespected. And in his anger, he decided on a punishment that would affect all of humanity. He declared that humans would no longer have access to fire. Without fire, they couldn't cook their meat, couldn't keep warm, couldn't work metal, couldn't light the darkness. It was a death sentence, really. A slow condemnation to live as beasts rather than as thinking beings. Prometheus watched the humans suffer, watched them huddle in caves, shivering, afraid, unable to advance, and he made a decision that would cost him everything. He waited until the sun was high, then he approached the sun's chariot. He lit a hollow fennel stalk with the sun's fire, concealing the flame inside the stalk. Then he descended to earth and gave fire to humanity. The effect was immediate. Humans learned to cook, making food safer and more nutritious. They learned to warm themselves, surviving cold that would have killed them. They learned to work bronze and later iron, creating tools and weapons. They learned to fire pottery, to smelt metal, to forge. Fire allowed civilization to begin. Fire was the difference between living as animals and living as humans. But Zeus saw the smoke rising from human campfires, and he knew exactly what had happened. Only Prometheus would dare defy him so directly. Only Prometheus would put mortal welfare above divine command. Zeus's rage was terrible to behold. He ordered Hephaestus, the smith god, to forge chains that could not be broken. Then he had Prometheus dragged to the Caucasus, mountains, to a high peak where he could see the humans he'd helped, but could never reach them. There, Prometheus was chained to the rock, arms and legs bound, unable to move, unable to escape. But that wasn't enough punishment for Zeus. Every day an eagle, massive and fierce, would fly to the peak. Every day it would tear open Prometheus's belly and eat his liver. And because Prometheus was immortal, every night his liver would regenerate, growing back completely so the eagle could devour it again the next day. An eternal torture, endless agony, punishment for the crime of compassion. Prometheus would remain chained there for ages, until eventually Heracles, the greatest of human heroes, would free him. But that's a story for later. For now, Prometheus hung on his rock, suffering for humanity's sake, while the humans he'd saved began to build their first cities, unaware of the price that had been paid for their warmth. Zeus wasn't finished punishing humanity, though. He commissioned Hephaestus to create something new, something that had never existed before. Hephaestus, with his incredible skill, crafted a woman from clay. The first woman, because until this point, humanity was apparently all male, though how reproduction worked is never quite explained. This woman was given gifts by all the gods. Aphrodite gave her beauty and charm. Athena dressed her in silver robes and taught her crafts. Apollo gave her music. Hermes gave her cunning and a persuasive voice. And she was named Pandora, which means all gifted. Zeus then gave Pandora a large jar, sealed tight, and told her never to open it. He sent her to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, whose name means afterthought, because he always realized things too late. Prometheus had warned his brother never to accept gifts from Zeus, but Epimetheus saw Pandora, beautiful and charming, and immediately fell in love. He married her and brought the jar into his home. Pandora, curious as humans are, curious as the gods had designed her to be, eventually couldn't resist anymore. She opened the jar, and from it flew all the evils that would plague humanity forever. Disease, old age, death, despair, envy, hatred, violence, all the sufferings that make mortal life difficult poured out of that jar and spread across the world. By the time Pandora slammed the lid shut again, it was too late. Only one thing remained trapped inside the jar: hope. There's debate about what that means. Is hope trapped in the jar a good thing, meaning humans keep it? Or a bad thing, meaning it's locked away from them? The Greeks seem to view hope with suspicion sometimes, seeing it as a thing that prolongs suffering by making you believe things might get better when they won't. Either way, the jar was Zeus's revenge on humanity for receiving Prometheus's gift of fire. Knowledge would come with suffering. Civilization would have a cost. But even with these sufferings, humanity persisted. They spread across the earth, building cities and farms, creating cultures and kingdoms. The gods watched from Olympus, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering, always interfering, because they found mortal lives fascinating in their brevity. A human lifetime was like a candle to the gods, flickering bright for a moment before going dark. And perhaps that made each human life more interesting than their own eternal existence. The gods themselves were a family in the most dysfunctional sense of the word. Zeus ruled from his throne, wielding his thunderbolt, making final judgments on all matters divine and mortal. He was justice, law, order, fate. He was also prideful, lustful, jealous, and temperamental. Lightning storms were Zeus's moods made manifest, thunder his voice echoing across the sky. When he was pleased, the weather was clear and crops grew. When he was angry, storms devastated the land. His relationship with his wife Hera was legendary, and not in a good way. Hera was queen of the gods, goddess of marriage and family, protector of wives and childbirth. She was beautiful, powerful, dignified, and constantly, perpetually furious at her husband. Because Zeus couldn't stay faithful. He had affairs with goddesses, nymphs, mortal women, anyone who caught his fancy. He would transform himself into anything. A swan, a shower of gold, a bull, whatever it took. And each affair produced children, demigods, and heroes who would shape the mortal world. Hera's revenge was legendary. She couldn't punish Zeus directly. He was too powerful, the king of gods, so instead she punished his lovers and his illegitimate children. The mortal women who caught Zeus's eye often found themselves transformed into animals or driven mad. The children born of these unions faced Hera's wrath their entire lives, obstacles and monsters sent to destroy them, divine opposition that made their heroic quests even more challenging. The irony, of course, was that Hera was the goddess of marriage while trapped in the worst marriage in mythology. She represented the sanctity of the bond between husband and wife, while her own husband mocked that bond constantly. It created a strange duality in her nature. To those who honored marriage, who were faithful spouses, she was a powerful protector. To Zeus's mistresses and bastards, she was the most terrifying enemy imaginable. Poseidon ruled the seas from his palace beneath the waves, a structure of coral and pearl, of flowing currents and strange beauty. He rode in a chariot pulled by hippocampi, half-horse, half-fish creatures, and wherever he went, the seas responded to his mood. Poseidon was temperamental, like the oceans he ruled. Calm one moment, raging the next. He could be generous to those who honored him, granting safe passage and bountiful fishing. But cross him, and he would send storms that could sink entire fleets, sea monsters that devoured ships, earthquakes that toppled cities. He'd lost the contest for Athens to Athena, his niece, when the citizens chose her gift of the olive tree over his gift of a saltwater spring. He never quite got over that. His rivalry with Athena simmered for centuries, playing out in the affairs of their respective favoured heroes and cities. He also had numerous affairs, like his brother, producing children both divine and mortal. His sons tended to be either great sailors or terrible monsters, sometimes both. Hades got perhaps the worst assignment in the division of the cosmos, though he made the best of it. The underworld was not inherently a place of punishment. It was simply where the dead went, all the dead, good and bad alike. The wicked were punished in Tartarus, the virtuous were rewarded in Elysium, and the vast majority of people, those who were neither particularly good nor particularly evil, wandered the asphodel meadows in a sort of grey, dreamlike existence. Hades rarely left his kingdom. He didn't attend the parties on Olympus. He didn't interfere in mortal affairs unless it directly concerned the dead. He was stern, serious, absolutely inflexible in his rules, but not cruel for the sake of cruelty. When heroes came to his realm seeking to cheat death or retrieve lost loved ones, he sometimes listened to their pleas, though he rarely granted them. His most famous interaction with the upper world was the abduction of Persephone. He saw her gathering flowers in a meadow, fell in love, and simply took her, dragging her down to the underworld to be his queen. Her mother Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was so grief-stricken that she stopped all plants from growing. The world entered an endless winter. People starved, crops failed. Zeus was forced to intervene, demanding Hades return Persephone. But Hades, clever and legalistic, had given Persephone pomegranate seeds to eat. Anyone who consumed food in the underworld became bound to it, unable to leave permanently. Persephone had eaten, so she couldn't return fully to her mother. The compromise was this. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with Hades, and part with her mother on earth. When she descends to the underworld each year, Demeter grieves and winter comes. When Persephone returns each spring, Demeter rejoices and plants grow again. The seasons themselves are the product of a mother's grief and a daughter's divided loyalty. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, burst from Zeus's head, fully formed and fully armed, after Zeus swallowed her mother Metis. Zeus had learned that any son born to Metis would overthrow him, continuing the cycle. So he did what his father had done. He swallowed the mother. But Metis was already pregnant, and inside Zeus, she forged armor and weapons for her daughter. The pounding gave Zeus terrible headaches until Hephaestus split his skull open with an axe, and Athena emerged, grey-eyed and war-ready. She was never a child. She went from non-existence to full adult, godhood in an instant, skipping every stage of development. Maybe that's why she seemed so controlled, so rational, so strategic. She was war, but war as tactics and planning, not war as rage and bloodlust. That was Ares' domain. Athena's warfare was about protecting cities, about just causes, about clever strategies that minimize bloodshed while achieving victory. She was the patron of heroes, appearing to guide Perseus, Odysseus, Heracles, and countless others. She gave them advice, weapons, protection. In return, they honored her in their victories, built temples to her wisdom, named cities after her. Athens, the greatest city in Greece, bore her name because she'd won the patronage by offering something peaceful, the olive tree, a source of food, oil, wood, and trade. Poseidon's saltwater spring was impressive, but useless. Athena understood that civilizations aren't built on spectacle, but on practical gifts that improve daily life. Apollo, son of Zeus and the Titaness Leto, was god of so many things that listing them all takes effort. He was the sun, driving the solar chariot across the sky each day. He was music, playing the lyre with skill no mortal could match. He was prophecy, speaking through the oracle at Delphi, giving cryptic predictions that always came true, but never in the way anyone expected. He was healing, able to cure diseases, though he could also send plagues when angered. He was poetry, art, archery, youth, beauty, and a dozen other domains. He was beautiful, impossibly so, with golden hair and features that made mortals weep just looking at him. But his love life was tragic. He fell for Daphne, a nymph who wanted nothing to do with him and transformed into a laurel tree to escape him. He loved Hyacinthus, a Spartan prince, who died when a discus Apollo threw was blown off course. He loved Cassandra, the Trojan princess, and gave her the gift of prophecy. But when she rejected him, he cursed her so that no one would ever believe her predictions, no matter how true they were. His twin sister Artemis was his opposite in many ways. Where Apollo was associated with the sun, Artemis was the moon. Where he was god of civilization's arts, she was goddess of the wilderness. She was the hunt, the chase, the wild places where civilization didn't reach. She led a band of virgin huntresses, young women who swore off men and marriage to devote themselves to the wild goddess. She was fiercely protective of these women and of children, especially girls. But she was also merciless to those who offended her. Hunters who boasted they were better than her found themselves transformed into stags and torn apart by their own hounds. Men who saw her bathing were turned into animals. She protected the innocent, but showed no mercy to the disrespectful. Ares, god of war, was perhaps the least liked among the Olympians. Even his own parents, Zeus and Hera, couldn't stand him most of the time. He represented war at its worst, bloodlust, violence, for its own sake, the chaos and horror of battle. Where Athena was strategic, Ares was reckless. Where Athena fought for causes, Ares just loved the fighting itself. He was constantly wounded in battle, constantly causing problems, constantly starting conflicts just for the thrill of it. The other gods tolerated him because he was Zeus's son, but they didn't like him. Mortals feared him, but didn't honor him with the same devotion they showed other gods. His affair with Aphrodite was one of the great scandals of Olympus. Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, the smith god, but she found him ugly and boring. Ares, brutish and violent as he was, held a certain appeal. They conducted their affair in secret, or so they thought. Hephaestus, though, was clever. He forged a net of unbreakable chains so fine they were invisible. He set a trap in Aphrodite's bedroom. When the lovers next met, the net fell upon them, binding them together in a very compromising position. Then Hephaestus called all the gods to come see, to witness his wife's betrayal. The gods came, and most of them laughed. Ares and Aphrodite became the joke of Olympus, caught literally in the act. Aphrodite, born from the sea foam of Uranus's castration, was beauty personified, desire made divine. She could make anyone fall in love with anyone else. Her power extended to gods and mortals alike. When she wanted something, she simply made people desire it, made them obsessed with it. Wars were fought over women she blessed with beauty. Cities fell because of loves she inspired. The entire Trojan War started because of a beauty contest she won and a promise she made to a Trojan prince. She was vain, petty, jealous, and absolutely irresistible. Men and gods alike fell over themselves trying to win her favor. She bore children to Ares, Eros, the god of romantic love, and Phobos and Deimos, fear and panic, who accompanied their father to war. To other lovers, she bore other children, demigods and spirits of love and beauty, each spreading her influence further across the world. Hephaestus, her unfortunate husband, was the god of the forge, of fire, of craftsmanship, and metalworking. He was the only Olympian who was physically imperfect, born with a deformed leg that caused him to limp. Hera, his mother, was so ashamed of his appearance that she threw him from Olympus when he was born. He fell for a full day before landing in the ocean, where the sea nymphs Theseus and Eurynome rescued him and raised him in their underwater grotto. There, Hephaestus learned his craft. He worked metal, learned to forge, created beautiful objects from precious materials. He made jewelry for the nymphs who raised him, and eventually his work became so renowned that the gods called him back to Olympus. He built their palaces, forged their weapons, created automatons and magical objects that defied explanation. His workshops were beneath volcanoes, where he worked alongside the Cyclopes, his massive bellows pumping, his hammers ringing against divine metal. Despite his wife's infidelities, Hephaestus remained the most skilled craftsman in existence. When the gods needed something made, they came to him. The armor Achilles wore at Troy, forged by Hephaestus and described in intricate detail by Homer. Pandora, the first woman, shaped by his hands. The chains that bound Prometheus, unbreakable. The palace of the sun. The arrows of Apollo and Artemis. Every important object in Greek mythology passed through Hephaestus's forge at some point. Hermes was the messenger god, and that description doesn't do him justice. He was the god of travelers, which makes sense for a messenger. But he was also the god of thieves, tricksters, merchants, shepherds, athletes, and anyone who relied on quick wits and fast feet. He wore winged sandals that let him fly between Earth and Olympus in seconds. He carried the caduceus, a staff with two serpents twined around it, which could put people to sleep or wake them. He was born in a cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia. On the very day of his birth, he crawled out of his cradle, found a tortoise, killed it, and used its shell to invent the lyre. Then he stole Apollo's sacred cattle, clever infant that he was, making them walk backwards so their tracks led in the wrong direction. Apollo eventually tracked him down, and Hermes charmed his way out of punishment by giving Apollo the lyre he'd invented. Apollo was so delighted with the instrument that he gave Hermes the cattle in return, and they became fast friends. Hermes also served as the psychopomp, the guide of souls to the underworld. When mortals died, it was Hermes who led their shades down to the underworld, who helped them cross the river Styx, who delivered them to Hades' judgment. He moved between all three realms, Olympus, Earth, and the underworld, the only god besides Hades himself who could travel freely to the land of the dead. Demeter, as we discussed before, was the goddess of harvest and agriculture. She controlled the growth of crops, the fertility of soil, the cycle of seasons. She was associated with the Eleusinian mysteries, secret religious rites performed in her honor that promised initiates a better fate in the afterlife. What exactly happened in these mysteries was never written down. Initiates were sworn to absolute secrecy on pain of death. Whatever Demeter's secrets were, they remained secret. Hestia, the firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, was the goddess of the hearth and home. She had the distinction of being both first and last, first to be swallowed, last to be regurgitated. She could have been a major player in divine politics, but she chose differently. She swore an oath of eternal virginity and asked Zeus if she could simply tend the sacred hearth on Olympus. He agreed, and Hestia found peace in that role. She was worshipped in every home, the center of family life, but she had no grand myths, no epic adventures. She simply was, constant and present, the still point in the chaos of divine affairs. Dionysus, the god of wine, was a later addition to the Olympians. His mother was Semele, a mortal princess. Zeus fell in love with her, and Hera, in her jealousy, tricked Semele into asking Zeus to appear in his true divine form. Zeus tried to refuse, knowing what would happen, but Semele insisted. When Zeus revealed himself in his full glory, the sight was too much for mortal eyes. Semele burned to ash, consumed by divine radiance. But Zeus rescued the fetus from her womb and sewed it into his own thigh, carrying the baby to term himself. Thus, Dionysus was twice born, once from his mother, once from his father. Dionysus wandered the world teaching the cultivation of grapes and the making of wine. His followers, mostly women called Maenads, would work themselves into ecstatic frenzies, dancing wildly, sometimes tearing apart animals with their bare hands. Dionysus represented release from restraint, freedom from civilization's rules, the chaos that lurks beneath ordered society. His worship was both celebrated and feared, because when the madness of Dionysus took hold, people did things they would never normally do. These gods, these 12, more or less, depending on which traditions you follow, ruled from Olympus. They interfered constantly in mortal affairs. They had children with mortals, creating a generation of heroes who were neither fully human nor fully divine. And it's to these heroes we should turn now, because their stories are where mythology becomes most vivid, most human, most relatable. Perseus was one of the earliest great heroes. His grandfather, King Acrisius of Argos, received a prophecy that his grandson would kill him. So Acrisius locked his daughter Danae in a bronze tower, ensuring she would never meet a man and thus never have children. But Zeus, as Zeus was wont to do, desired Danae. He transformed himself into a shower of golden rain and fell through the roof of her prison. 9 months later, Perseus was born. When Acrisius discovered his daughter had given birth, he was furious, but also afraid. Killing his own daughter and grandson directly would bring the curse of the Furies. So instead, he locked both Danae and baby Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, leaving their fate to the gods. The chest floated for days before washing up on the shore of the island of Seriphos. A fisherman named Dictys found them and took them in, raising Perseus as his own son. Perseus grew into a strong young man, devoted to his mother, brave and clever. But King Polydectes of Seriphos desired Danae and saw Perseus as an obstacle. So Polydectes came up with a plan. He announced he was going to marry, and by custom, all the nobles and prominent men had to bring gifts, usually horses. Perseus, poor as he was, had no horse to give. Publicly, in front of everyone, Polydectes mocked him. In a moment of pride and anger, Perseus proclaimed he would bring Polydectes any gift he named, anything at all. Polydectes smiled and named his price, the head of Medusa. Medusa was one of the 3 Gorgons, monstrous sisters who lived at the edge of the world. She had once been beautiful, a priestess of Athena, but Poseidon raped her in Athena's temple. Athena, unable or unwilling to punish Poseidon, punished Medusa instead, transforming her into a monster. Her hair became a mass of living, venomous snakes. Her face became so hideous that anyone who looked directly at it turned instantly to stone. She and her sisters lived in a remote cave surrounded by the stone statues of those who had tried to approach them. Perseus's boast had sentenced him to death. But the gods, specifically Athena and Hermes, decided to help. Maybe they felt guilty about what had been done to Medusa. Maybe they just liked Perseus. Either way, Athena appeared to him and gave him her polished bronze shield, so reflective it could serve as a mirror. Hermes gave him an adamantine sword, sharp enough to cut through anything. But there were other items he would need, and to get those, he had to find the Graeae. The Graeae were 3 ancient sisters who shared 1 eye and 1 tooth among them, passing them back and forth. They knew where the Gorgons lived, and they also knew where Perseus could find the other items he needed. Perseus found them and waited until they were passing the eye from one to another. In that brief moment when none of them could see, he snatched the eye. He told them he would return it only if they gave him directions to the Gorgons and told him where to find the winged sandals, the kibisis, and the helm of darkness. Reluctantly, the Graeae told him. Perseus flew to a garden of the Hesperides, where nymphs gave him the winged sandals of Hermes, which allowed him to fly. They gave him the kibisis, a special bag that could safely hold Medusa's head without turning him to stone through the fabric. And they directed him to where he could borrow Hades's helm of darkness, which made the wearer invisible. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus flew to the edge of the world, to the cave where the Gorgons slept surrounded by stone victims. He landed softly, invisible in Hades's helm. Using Athena's shield as a mirror, he looked at Medusa's reflection instead of at her directly. He approached slowly. Her snake hair hissed and writhed, sensing his presence, but not seeing him. In one swift motion, he brought the adamantine blade down and severed her head. From her neck, as her blood poured out, 2 beings were born. Pegasus, the winged horse, flew up into the sky, and Chrysaea, whose name means golden sword, emerged fully grown. These were the children Medusa had conceived when Poseidon raped her, trapped inside her until her death released them. Perseus grabbed Medusa's head, careful not to look at it, and stuffed it into the kibisis. Then he flew away, as her 2 sisters, awakened by the commotion, searched frantically for the invisible killer they couldn't find. On his flight back to Seriphos, Perseus passed by the coast of Ethiopia. There he saw a young woman chained to a rock by the sea, waves crashing around her, and a terrible sea monster rising from the depths to devour her. Perseus landed and learned her story. Her name was Andromeda. Her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, had boasted that Andromeda was more beautiful than the sea nymphs. The nymphs, offended, complained to Poseidon, who sent a sea monster to devastate the kingdom. An oracle said the only way to save the land was to sacrifice Andromeda to the monster. Perseus, heroic and perhaps a bit impulsive, offered a deal to Andromeda's desperate parents. He would kill the monster if they agreed to let him marry Andromeda afterward. They agreed immediately. As the monster approached, Perseus revealed Medusa's head. The creature looked upon it and instantly turned to stone, a massive statue of a sea serpent that stood frozen in the waves. Perseus freed Andromeda, and after some drama involving her previous fiancé, they married and began the journey back to Seriphos together. When Perseus arrived home, he found that King Polydectes had been pressuring his mother Danae to marry him, making her life miserable while Perseus was away. Polydectes hadn't expected Perseus to return alive. Perseus crashed the king's feast, announced his return, and when Polydectes mockingly demanded proof, Perseus produced Medusa's head. Polydectes and all his supporters turned to stone, frozen forever in their moment of mockery. Perseus gave Medusa's head to Athena, who placed it on her shield, the Aegis, where it would ward off her enemies. He married Andromeda, and they traveled to visit his grandfather in Argos. But when Acrisius heard Perseus was coming, remembering the prophecy, he fled in fear. Years later, Perseus was competing in athletic games in another city. During the discus throw, his discus went wild, flew into the crowd, and struck and killed an old man who was watching. That man was Acrisius, who had fled to that very city. The prophecy was fulfilled despite, or perhaps because of, everything Acrisius had done to prevent it. Perseus founded the city of Mycenae and ruled there with Andromeda. Their children included Perses, who became an ancestor of the Persians, and Alcaeus, whose descendant would be Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes. But before we get to Heracles, there's another hero whose story demands telling. Theseus, the great king of Athens, slayer of the Minotaur, the man who would define what it meant to be Athenian. Theseus's parentage was ambiguous. His mother, Aethra, was visited in a single night by both King Aegeus of Athens and the god Poseidon. So Theseus was either Aegeus's son or Poseidon's son, mortal prince or demigod, and the ambiguity would define much of his life. Before leaving, Aegeus placed his sword and sandals under a massive boulder and told Aethra that when the boy was strong enough to lift the boulder, he should bring the items to Athens and claim his birthright. Theseus grew strong and clever. When he reached young adulthood, he lifted the boulder with ease, claimed his father's sword and sandals, and set out for Athens. He could have taken the easy sea route, but he chose the dangerous overland path, specifically because it was dangerous. Along the way, he encountered 6 criminals and monsters, each of whom had been terrorizing travelers. He defeated them all in ways that mirrored their own crimes. Periphetes, who clubbed travelers with an iron club, was beaten to death with his own weapon. Sinis, who bent pine trees to the ground and tied people between them before releasing the trees to tear them apart, was killed the exact same way. The Crommyonian sow, a giant boar, was slain. Siren, who kicked travelers off a cliff, was kicked off his own cliff. Cercion, who forced people into wrestling matches he always won, was beaten in wrestling and killed. And Procrustes, who stretched short people or cut tall people to fit his iron bed, was fitted to his own bed with fatal results. These 6 labours established Theseus's reputation before he even reached Athens. When he arrived, however, his father Aegeus didn't recognize him. Aegeus was married to Medea, yes, that Medea from the Jason story, who had fled to Athens after murdering her children. Medea, being a witch, recognized Theseus and realized he threatened her position. She convinced Aegeus that this strong young stranger was dangerous and should be eliminated. Aegeus, trusting his wife, offered Theseus poisoned wine at a feast. But as Theseus reached for the cup, he drew his sword to cut his meat, and Aegeus saw the blade. His blade, the one he'd left under the boulder. He knocked the poisoned cup from Theseus's hand and embraced his son. Medea fled Athens, her plot exposed, and Theseus was acknowledged as the Prince of Athens. But Athens had a problem. Years before, King Minos of Crete had sent his son to Athens for games. The prince was murdered, possibly by the Athenians themselves, out of jealousy because he kept winning. Minos, the most powerful king in the Mediterranean, attacked Athens with his fleet and demanded a terrible tribute. Every 9 years, Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete, where they would be imprisoned in the labyrinth and devoured by the Minotaur. The Minotaur was Minos's shame, literally. His wife Pasiphae had fallen in love with a magnificent bull, a divine animal sent by Poseidon. With the help of Daedalus, the master craftsman, she had conceived a child with the bull. That child was the Minotaur, head of a bull, body of a man, strength beyond human, hunger that could only be satisfied with human flesh. Minos couldn't kill the creature, his own stepson after all, so he had Daedalus build the labyrinth, a maze so complex that anyone who entered could never find their way out. The Minotaur was imprisoned there, and Athens' children were fed to it as tribute. When the time came for the third tribute, Theseus volunteered to be one of the 7 young men. He swore to his father that he would kill the Minotaur and end the tribute. The ship carrying the tributes sailed with black sails, mourning sails. Theseus promised that if he succeeded, he would change the sails to white on his return journey, so Aegeus would know his son was alive before the ship even reached harbour. In Crete, the tributes were paraded before King Minos and his court. Princess Ariadne, Minos' daughter, was present, and the moment she saw Theseus, she fell in love. This wasn't her choice, exactly. Aphrodite, for reasons of her own, had struck Ariadne with overwhelming desire for the Athenian prince. Love at first sight in Greek mythology was usually a god's doing, not a natural phenomenon. Ariadne knew the labyrinth was inescapable. Many heroes had tried to kill the Minotaur, and their bones littered the passages. But she also knew someone who might be able to help. Daedalus, the man who built the maze. She went to him and begged for a solution. Daedalus gave her a ball of thread and simple instructions. Tie one end at the entrance, unravel it as you walk, and follow it back. Obvious when you think about it, impossible when you're lost in the dark twists of the maze. Ariadne found Theseus and offered him the thread on one condition. If he survived, he had to take her away from Crete and marry her. Theseus agreed. Love was probably not his primary concern at the moment, but survival absolutely was. He took the thread. When the tributes were forced into the labyrinth, Theseus went first. He tied one end of the thread to the entrance and let the ball unravel as he led the others deeper into the maze. They walked for what felt like hours, the stone walls pressing close, the passage turning endlessly, sometimes climbing, sometimes descending, until they completely lost any sense of direction. Only the thread behind them provided any sense of orientation. Then they heard it. Breathing. Heavy, animal breathing, and underneath that, a sound almost like moaning. They rounded a corner and found the Minotaur's chamber. The creature was massive, standing on 2 legs like a man, but with the head and neck of a bull, horns sharp and deadly. Its eyes reflected the torchlight, and when it saw them, it bellowed. The other Athenians scattered, hiding in side passages. Theseus stood his ground. He had his father's sword, but he also had his bare hands, and there's debate about which he actually used. The battle in the darkness was brutal and brief. The Minotaur charged. Theseus dodged. They grappled. They fought. And ultimately, Theseus prevailed. Whether by blade or by strangling, the stories differ. The Minotaur fell. Its unnatural life ended. Its eternal hunger finally satisfied by death. Theseus gathered the tributes and followed the thread back to the entrance. They emerged from the labyrinth alive, something no one had ever done before. Ariadne was waiting. They sabotaged Minos' ship so they couldn't be pursued, then fled on the Athenian vessel. The journey back should have been triumphant, but it wasn't. They stopped at the island of Naxos to rest, and there, either because the god Dionysus appeared to him in a dream and demanded Ariadne for himself, or because Theseus simply had second thoughts about bringing home a foreign bride, or because he was a coward and an oaf, Theseus abandoned Ariadne. While she slept on the beach, he ordered his crew to set sail quietly. She woke to find herself alone on an empty shore, watching the ship disappear over the horizon. Ariadne's story has a happy ending, though. Dionysus found her there, heartbroken and betrayed. He fell in love with her genuinely, not through Aphrodite's manipulation, and he made her his wife. More than that, he made her immortal. When she died, he placed her wedding crown in the sky as the constellation Corona Borealis. So the princess who helped slay the Minotaur and was abandoned for her kindness became a goddess, which is better than most mortals manage. But Theseus paid a price for his betrayal. In his distraction, in his guilt perhaps, he forgot his promise to his father. He forgot to change the sails from black to white. The ship approached Athens with morning sails still flying. Aegeus, watching from a cliff for his son's return, saw the black sails and knew what they meant. His son was dead. In his grief, Aegeus threw himself from the cliff into the sea. The sea that bears his name now, the Aegean, is named for a father's grief and a son's forgetfulness. Theseus returned to Athens as king, but found the kingdom in chaos. The people were divided into separate communities, each with its own interests. Theseus set about unifying them, establishing Athens as the single power center of Attica. He convinced the separate towns to give up their local councils and recognize Athens as the capital. He established citizenship, created festivals, and laid the groundwork for what would eventually become Athenian democracy. He was more than a hero. He was a founder, a lawgiver, a king who shaped his city into greatness. He had other adventures. He joined the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece, though his role there was minor. He went with Heracles on a campaign against the Amazons, where he either abducted or fell in love with their queen Hippolyta, bringing her back to Athens where she bore him a son, Hippolytus. He attempted to abduct Helen of Sparta when she was just a child, planning to wait until she was old enough to marry, which makes him considerably less heroic. That plan failed. He and his friend Pirithous even descended to the underworld to try to kidnap Persephone herself for Pirithous to marry, which was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Hades, not amused, trapped them in the chairs of forgetfulness, seats that made them forget who they were and held them immobile. Heracles eventually rescued Theseus, but Pirithous remained trapped forever. Theseus's final years were sad. His people turned against him, tired of his arrogance. He was exiled and ended up on the island of Syros, where the king, pretending friendship, pushed him off a cliff to his death. The great hero of Athens died alone, away from the city he'd unified, murdered by a supposed friend. But Athens never forgot him. Centuries later, the Athenians recovered what they believed were his bones and brought them home, honoring him as the greatest of their founders. Now we come to Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, and his story is so vast that it could fill nights on its own. He was the greatest hero Greece ever produced, the strongest man who ever lived, and possibly the most tragic. His very existence was an insult to Hera. Zeus had seen a mortal woman named Alcmene and desired her. She was married to Amphitryon, a noble and honorable man. Zeus disguised himself as Amphitryon and visited Alcmene while her real husband was away at war. When Amphitryon returned the next day, he also lay with his wife. From that one night, twins were conceived: Heracles, son of Zeus, and Iphicles, son of Amphitryon. Zeus, in his pride, announced that a descendant of Perseus would be born that day, who would rule all others. Hera, hearing this and knowing her husband had been unfaithful again, acted quickly. She went to Ilithyia, goddess of childbirth, and delayed Alcmene's labor. Meanwhile, she caused another descendant of Perseus, Eurystheus, to be born premature. Because Eurystheus was born first, Zeus's oath meant he would be the ruling king, not Heracles. It was Hera's first revenge, but far from her last. When Heracles was just 8 months old, Hera sent 2 massive serpents to kill him in his cradle. His mortal twin, Iphicles, screamed in terror. But baby Heracles grabbed both snakes and strangled them with his bare hands, laughing as he did so. His parents rushed in to find their infant son playing with 2 dead serpents, and they realized this was no ordinary child. Heracles grew up strong beyond measure, but also kind and noble. He was educated by the best teachers. The centaur Chiron taught him medicine, hunting, and ethics. He learned music, though he wasn't very good at it. There's a story that his music teacher, Linus, struck him for playing poorly. Heracles, not yet understanding his own strength, struck back and accidentally killed the teacher with 1 blow. It was the first hint that Heracles' strength would be as much curse as gift. He grew to manhood and performed his first great labors, saving the city of Thebes from tribute to the neighboring minions. King Creon of Thebes, grateful, gave Heracles his daughter Megara as a wife. They married, and Megara bore him 3 sons. For a time, Heracles was happy. He had a family, honor, peace. He should have known it wouldn't last. Hera sent madness upon him. One moment he was himself, the next he was lost, in delusions. He looked at his own children and saw enemies. He looked at his wife and saw a threat. In his madness, driven by Hera's curse, Heracles murdered his own children. Some versions say he killed Megara too. Others say she survived but couldn't stay with him after what he'd done. When the madness lifted and Heracles saw what he'd done, his grief was bottomless. He wanted to die, but his friends, particularly Theseus, convinced him that suicide would be cowardice. Instead, he went to the oracle at Delphi to ask how he could atone for this unforgivable crime. The oracle told him to submit himself to King Eurystheus, his cousin, the man who had stolen his birthright. He was to serve Eurystheus for 12 years and complete whatever labors the king assigned. Only then would he be purified of his crime. So Heracles, the strongest man alive, the son of Zeus, went to Eurystheus and pledged his service. And Eurystheus, cowardly and petty, took delight in assigning impossible, humiliating, and deadly tasks. These became known as the 12 labors of Heracles. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a beast with hide so thick that no weapon could pierce it. Heracles tried arrows, spears, even his club. Nothing worked, so he wrestled the lion with his bare hands, eventually strangling it. He used the lion's own claws to skin it, and from then on, he wore the Nemean lion's hide as armor, impervious to any weapon. The second labor was to slay the Lernaean hydra, a water serpent with multiple heads that grew back too for everyone that was cut off. Worse, its blood was so poisonous that even breathing the fumes could kill. Heracles fought it with his nephew Iolaus helping him. Each time Heracles cut off a head, Iolaus would cauterize the stump with fire, preventing new heads from growing. They finally killed the hydra, and Heracles dipped his arrows in its blood, making them deadly with just a scratch. The third labor was to capture the Ceryneian hind, a deer sacred to Artemis, with golden antlers and bronze hooves, impossibly fast. Heracles chased it for a full year before finally capturing it without harming it. Mindful that killing Artemis's sacred animal would bring divine wrath he couldn't afford. The fourth labor was to capture the Erymanthian boar, a massive beast terrorizing the mountains. Heracles drove it into deep snow where it got stuck, then captured it alive and brought it back slung over his shoulders. Eurystheus was so terrified at the sight of the monster that he hid in a large bronze jar. The fifth labor was to clean the Augean stables in a single day. King Augeas had a massive herd of cattle, and their stables hadn't been cleaned in decades. The filth was piled so high, it seemed an impossible task, which was exactly the point. Heracles rerouted 2 rivers to flow through the stables, washing away all the filth in a few hours. Eurystheus tried to claim this didn't count, because Heracles had used trickery instead of strength, but the oracle ruled it was still valid. The sixth labor was to drive away the Stymphalian birds, massive man-eating birds with bronze beaks and metal feathers they could launch like arrows. Athena gave Heracles a rattle made by Hephaestus. The noise scared the birds into flight, and Heracles shot down as many as he could with his poisoned arrows. The seventh labor was to capture the Cretan bull, the same bull that had fathered the Minotaur. It was rampaging across Crete. Heracles captured it and brought it back alive. Eurystheus released it, and it eventually ended up in Marathon, where Theseus killed it. The eighth labor was to steal the mares of Diomedes, horses that had been fed human flesh until they developed a taste for it. Heracles fed them their own owner, King Diomedes, which broke the spell. The horses became calm and were led back to Eurystheus. The ninth labor was to obtain the belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. The Amazons were a warrior society of women. Hippolyta was actually willing to give Heracles the belt peacefully, but Hera, disguised as an Amazon, spread rumors that Heracles planned to kidnap their queen. The Amazons attacked, Heracles fought back, and in the chaos, Hippolyta was killed. The 10th labor was to steal the cattle of Geryon, a giant with 3 bodies joined at the waist. Heracles traveled to the edge of the world, erected the Pillars of Heracles at what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, killed Geryon and his 2-headed guard dog, and drove the cattle back to Greece, a journey that took years and included dozens of side adventures. The 11th labor was to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides. These apples granted immortality and grew in a garden at the edge of the world, guarded by a dragon and the Hesperides nymphs. Heracles couldn't enter the garden himself, so he convinced Atlas, who was still holding up the sky, to get the apples for him. Heracles held the sky while Atlas retrieved them. When Atlas returned and realized how good it felt to be free of the burden, he tried to leave Heracles holding the sky forever. But Heracles tricked him, asking Atlas to hold the sky just for a moment while he adjusted his cloak. Atlas took the sky back, and Heracles grabbed the apples and fled. The 12th and final labor was to capture Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the underworld, and bring him to the surface. Heracles descended to the underworld and asked Hades for permission. Hades agreed, but only if Heracles could subdue Cerberus without using weapons. Heracles wrestled the massive hound into submission using just his strength, carried him to the surface, showed him to Eurystheus, then returned him safely to the underworld. While there, Heracles also freed Theseus from the chair of forgetfulness, though he couldn't free Pirate House. With the 12 labors complete, Heracles was finally purified of his crime. But his story didn't end. He had dozens of other adventures, fought wars, won and lost, loves, committed more crimes, and endured more punishments. Eventually, he married Deianira, who accidentally killed him with a poisoned robe, not knowing it was poisoned. As Heracles died in agony, Zeus took pity on his son and brought him to Olympus. Heracles was made a god, reconciled with Hera, and married Hebe, goddess of youth. He was the only mortal hero to achieve full divinity, not just a place in the underworld's Elysium, but actual godhood on Olympus itself. Jason and the Argonauts represents a different kind of hero story: the quest, the journey, the team adventure. Jason was the rightful king of Iolcus, but his uncle Peleus had usurped the throne. When Jason came of age and demanded his birthright, Peleus said he would step aside if Jason completed one task: bring back the golden fleece from Colchis at the edge of the world. The golden fleece was the hide of a flying ram that had once rescued 2 children from sacrifice. The ram was killed in Colchis, and its fleece was hung in a sacred grove, guarded by a dragon that never slept. It was considered impossible to obtain, which is why Peleus chose it. Jason commissioned a ship, the Argo, built with timber from the sacred oak of Dodona, which gave it prophetic powers. Then he assembled a crew of the greatest heroes in Greece. The Argonauts included Heracles, Orpheus the musician, Castor and Pollux, Atalanta the huntress, and dozens of others. It was the Avengers of ancient Greece, a team-up of legendary figures. Their journey to Colchis was full of adventures. They stopped at Lemnos, an island populated entirely by women who had killed their husbands and were desperate for new men. They rescued the blind prophet Phineus from the Harpies, foul creatures that would steal or defile his food before he could eat. In gratitude, Phineus told them how to pass the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that crushed any ship trying to pass between them. Following his advice, they sent a dove through first. The rocks crashed on the dove, and in the moment they took to reopen, the Argo rode through at full speed, losing only the tip of its stern ornament. When they reached Colchis, King Aeetes was not inclined to give up the fleece. He set Jason a challenge. Jason would have to yoke 2 bronze bulls that breathed fire, plough a field with them, then sow the field with dragon's teeth, which would sprout into armed warriors. If Jason could complete these tasks, he could have the fleece. This was meant to be impossible, but Aeetes' daughter, Medea, a powerful sorceress, fell in love with Jason. Hera and Aphrodite had ensured this, manipulating events because they wanted the fleece obtained for reasons of their own. Medea gave Jason a magical ointment that made him fireproof and invulnerable for one day. She told him how to defeat the warriors, throw a stone among them, and they would fight each other instead of him. Jason completed the tasks with Medea's help, but Aeetes still refused to give up the fleece. So that night, Medea led Jason to the sacred grove. She used her magic to put the guardian dragon to sleep. Jason grabbed the golden fleece, and they fled, knowing Aeetes would pursue them. Medea's love for Jason drove her to terrible acts. When Aeetes' ships were gaining on the Argo, Medea killed her own brother who was with them, dismembered his body, and threw the pieces overboard, knowing her father would stop to collect them for proper burial. The delay allowed the Argonauts to escape. They returned to Iolcus, triumphant, but Peleus refused to give up the throne. Medea, ever helpful to Jason, tricked Peleus' daughters into killing their own father. She demonstrated on an old ram, cutting it up and boiling it with herbs, claiming it would restore its youth. When it appeared to work, Peleus' daughters did the same to their father, but Medea used different herbs. Peleus died, and Jason and Medea were forced to flee, hated for their role in the king's death. They ended up in Corinth, where they had children and lived for years. But then Jason met Glauce, the princess of Corinth. She was young, beautiful, politically advantageous. Jason decided to divorce Medea and marry Glauce. After everything Medea had done for him, after the crimes she'd committed for his sake, he was casting her aside for a better offer. Medea's revenge was monstrous. She sent Glauce a beautiful robe and crown as gifts. When Glauce put them on, they burst into magical flames that wouldn't go out, burning her alive along with her father who tried to save her. Then Medea murdered her own children, Jason's sons, while he watched, unable to stop her. She escaped in a chariot pulled by dragons, leaving Jason alive, but destroyed. Jason wandered, broken and alone. Eventually, he returned to the rotting hulk of the Argo, now beached and abandoned. He sat in its shadow, remembering better days. A piece of the ship's beam, weakened by time, fell and struck him on the head, killing him. The great hero who had obtained the impossible fleece died alone, killed by his own ship, mourned by no one. Odysseus deserves his own long night of stories, and he got them. Homer's Odyssey is a masterwork of ancient literature, detailing his 10-year journey home from Troy. We don't have time for the full version now, but here's what you need to know. Odysseus was king of Ithaca, a clever, resourceful man who didn't want to go to the Trojan War. He pretended to be mad to avoid it, but was exposed. At Troy, his cleverness won the war. He came up with the idea of the Trojan horse, the massive wooden statue hiding Greek soldiers inside, the trick that finally breached Troy's walls. His journey home was cursed by Poseidon, whom Odysseus had angered by blinding Poseidon's son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. For 10 years, Odysseus was blown across the Mediterranean, encountering one danger after another. The lotus eaters who made men forget their homes, the Cyclops Polyphemus, whom Odysseus blinded and escaped from by hiding under sheep. Aeolus, king of winds, who gave Odysseus a bag of winds that his foolish crew opened. Circe the witch, who turned his men to pigs. The sirens, whose song lured sailors to their deaths. Scylla and Charybdis, the monsters that guarded a narrow strait. The island of the sun god, where his crew ate the sacred cattle and were punished with death. Finally, Odysseus arrived home alone, his entire crew dead, his ship destroyed. He found his palace overrun with suitors, dozens of men trying to force his wife Penelope to marry one of them, consuming his wealth, disrespecting his household. Penelope had remained faithful, cleverly delaying the suitors for years with various tricks. She didn't recognize Odysseus, disguised as an old beggar, but his dog did. His old hunting dog, Argos, barely lifted his head one last time, recognized his master after 20 years, and died, finally able to rest. Odysseus revealed himself, slaughtered the suitors with his bow, and reclaimed his kingdom and his wife. It was a rare happy ending in Greek mythology, though it had come at the cost of 10 years lost, his entire crew dead, and countless sorrows along the way. Other heroes deserve mention too, though their stories are shorter. Orpheus, the greatest musician who ever lived, son of Apollo and a muse. His music could move stones, tame beasts, make trees dance. He married Eurydice, and when she died from a snake bite, his grief was so profound that he descended to the underworld to bring her back. His music moved even Hades and Persephone, who agreed to release Eurydice on one condition. Orpheus must walk ahead of her, never looking back until they reached the surface. Just before reaching the exit, Orpheus, overwhelmed by doubt, looked back. Eurydice faded like mist, returned to death, lost forever. Orpheus wandered in grief until he was torn apart by Maenads, frenzied followers of Dionysus. His head, still singing, floated down a river to the sea. Atalanta, the huntress raised by bears, who participated in the Caledonian boar hunt and drew first blood on the massive beast. She was the fastest mortal alive, and she offered to marry any man who could beat her in a race. Those who lost were killed. Hippomenes finally beat her by using 3 golden apples given by Aphrodite, dropping them during the race so Atalanta would stop to pick them up. They married, but their happiness was brief. They made love in a temple of Zeus, who transformed them both into lions as punishment. The Greeks believed lions couldn't mate with each other, only with leopards, so Atalanta and Hippomenes were cursed to be together, but never to truly be together again. Bellerophon, who tamed Pegasus and rode the winged horse on impossible quests. He killed the Chimera, a monster that was part lion, part goat, and part serpent, by flying above it on Pegasus and shooting arrows down. He survived numerous assassination attempts and became a great hero. But then, pride consumed him. He attempted to ride Pegasus up to Olympus itself, to live among the gods as an equal. Zeus sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus. The horse bucked, and Bellerophon fell all the way back to Earth, surviving but crippled and blinded, spending the rest of his life wandering as a broken beggar. The message was clear. Mortals who try to rise too high will always be brought low. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greek forces at Troy, was the son of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph. His mother tried to make him invulnerable by dipping him in the river Styx, but she held him by his heel, leaving that one spot vulnerable. A prophet foretold 2 possible futures for Achilles: a long, peaceful life with no fame, or a short, glorious life as the greatest warrior of his age. He chose glory. At Troy, he was unbeatable in combat, but he was also prideful and temperamental. When Agamemnon, the Greek commander, took Achilles' war prize, Achilles refused to fight, sulking in his tent while the Trojans pushed the Greeks back to their ships. Only when his beloved friend Patroclus was killed by the Trojan hero Hector did Achilles return to battle, slaughter Hector in single combat, and defile his body by dragging it around Troy's walls. But his glory was brief. Paris, a Trojan prince who wasn't much of a warrior, shot an arrow guided by Apollo that struck Achilles in his one vulnerable spot, his heel. The greatest warrior fell to the weakest shot, and his name became immortal precisely because his life was so short. All these heroes, and so many more, shaped the age that the Greeks called the heroic age. It was a time when the gods still walked openly among mortals, when boundaries between human and divine were crossed regularly, when the impossible could be achieved through courage, cleverness, and divine favor. But it was also an age of tragedy, of hubris punished, of love turned to hate, of noble intentions leading to terrible consequences. The pattern repeats throughout Greek mythology. Mortals striving to be more than mortal, and usually paying a terrible price. Gods helping mortals but also destroying them on whims. Prophecies that come true precisely because people try to avoid them. The Greeks understood something fundamental about the universe. It's not fair, it's not just, and trying to fight fate only ensures that fate wins in exactly the way you fear most. These myths weren't just stories to the ancient Greeks. They were explanations for the world. Why do the seasons change? Persephone's annual journey to the underworld. Why do we have fire and civilization? Prometheus's theft and subsequent punishment. Why are there storms? Zeus's moods. Why do young people die? Because even heroes like Achilles, blessed by gods, can be brought down by a single arrow to the heel. The myths were also moral instruction, though not in the way we think of morals now. They weren't about being good and getting rewarded. They were about understanding the limits of human power, the dangers of pride, the importance of respecting the gods and accepting your fate. Heroes who tried to be gods were destroyed. Mortals who dishonored the gods faced terrible punishments. Even the gods themselves, when they overreached or broke cosmic laws, faced consequences. But the myths were also deeply human. The gods had all the same flaws as humans, just magnified by their power and immortality. Zeus's infidelities, Hera's jealousy, Poseidon's anger, Ares' love of violence, Aphrodite's vanity, these weren't abstract forces. They were recognizable human emotions and behaviors, taken to divine extremes. The Greeks looked at their gods and saw themselves, writ large and terrible and magnificent. The heroes, too, were flawed. Heracles murdered his family in madness. Theseus forgot to change his sails and caused his father's death. Jason betrayed the woman who'd given up everything for him. Odysseus's pride got his crew killed. Perseus accidentally fulfilled the prophecy he was trying to avoid. These weren't perfect paragons of virtue. They were people, extraordinary people certainly, capable of incredible feats, but still fundamentally human in their flaws and limitations. That's what makes Greek mythology endure. These stories from thousands of years ago still resonate because they're about the fundamental experiences of being human. Love and hate, courage and cowardice, wisdom and foolishness, the desire to achieve the impossible and the cost of that achievement. They're about how we relate to powers greater than ourselves, how we deal with fate, how we respond when life is unfair. Every time someone references an Achilles heel, or talks about opening Pandora's box, or describes a journey as Odyssey, they're drawing on these ancient myths. Every story about heroes fighting monsters, every tale of star-crossed lovers, every tragedy where the protagonist's own actions bring about their downfall, these all have their roots in Greek mythology. The archetypes established by these stories have shaped storytelling ever since. And maybe that's the final lesson of Greek mythology. Stories matter. They shape how we understand the world, how we see ourselves, how we interpret the forces that control our lives. The Greeks told stories about gods and heroes to make sense of a chaotic, often cruel universe. We still tell stories for the same reason. The names change, the details shift, but the fundamental questions remain. Why do we suffer? What gives life meaning? How should we respond to powers beyond our control? How can we be heroic in a world that often punishes heroism? The Greeks didn't have all the answers. Their mythology is full of contradictions. Their gods are often terrible. Their heroes frequently fail. But maybe that's the point. Life doesn't have neat answers. The universe isn't fair. Bad things happen to good people. Trying hard doesn't guarantee success. Being clever doesn't ensure you'll avoid disaster. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, fate wins anyway. But the heroes tried. They faced impossible odds, fought monsters, challenged gods, saved their people, achieved the impossible. They failed, they fell, they died, but they tried. And in the trying, they became immortal, not because they lived forever, but because their stories did. Perseus, Theseus, Heracles, Jason, Odysseus, they've been dead for millennia if they ever existed at all. But we're still telling their stories. We're still learning from their triumphs and their mistakes. From chaos, from that initial void of nothingness, emerged a universe full of gods and monsters and heroes. From primordial darkness came light. From violence came beauty. From suffering came civilization. The cycle of overthrow continued from Uranus to Cronus to Zeus, each generation replacing the last through conflict. The Titans gave way to the Olympians. The age of gods gave way to the age of heroes. And that age, too, eventually faded as mortals became more independent, relying less on divine intervention and more on their own capabilities. The Greeks believed that their own time, the Iron Age, was the worst of all the ages. They looked back at the heroic age with longing, imagining a time when gods still cared enough about mortals to involve themselves directly, when heroes could change the world through individual action. Whether that age ever truly existed doesn't really matter. The stories exist, the lessons exist, the archetypes exist, and those stories have traveled through time, passed from Greek to Roman, from ancient to medieval, from medieval to modern. They've been adapted, retold, reinterpreted countless times. Every generation finds new meanings in them, new relevance, new resonance. The specific gods may have faded. No one sacrifices to Zeus anymore. No one prays to Poseidon for safe passage on the seas. But the stories remain, as vital now as when they were first told around fires thousands of years ago. So from the void of chaos to the triumph of the Olympians, from the first titans to the last heroes, you've heard the complete story, or as complete as one night allows. The full mythology is vast, with countless minor gods and local heroes and regional variations. But the core, the essential arc from creation to the heroic age, that's what you've experienced tonight. And if you've made it this far, if you're still awake or drifting peacefully, thank you for taking this journey through ancient myth. If you enjoyed wandering through these stories, through this time when the boundaries between possible and impossible were porous at best, then please consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys through history's most fascinating tales. Click the notification bell to know when the next story arrives. These myths have survived thousands of years for good reason. They contain truths about human nature that time hasn't eroded. They ask questions that every generation must answer for itself. They provide templates for understanding our own struggles, our own heroes, our own monsters. The Greeks are long gone, their civilization dust, their gods silent. But the stories remain, and in remaining, they continue to shape us, continue to influence how we see the world and our place in it. That's the ultimate power of mythology. It transcends its origin, becomes universal, speaks to something fundamental in human consciousness. So rest easy, knowing that you've traced the arc of Greek mythology from beginning to its heroic heights. Let these ancient stories carry you gently into sleep. These tales of gods and monsters, of heroes and their quests, of love and loss, and the eternal struggle to make meaning in a chaotic universe. From chaos came order. From darkness came light. From myths came understanding. And from understanding, maybe, comes peace. Sleep well.